Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to Adab Literary Festival for inviting me to this great event, and it's wonderful to be back in Karachi. When we chose the title of my talk, which is Implications of U.S. Foreign Policy for South Asia, we hadn't planned that there would be new developments happening, but I guess it's timely to have this conversation. And when I travel anywhere in the world these days, in my capacity as a dean, there's always questions about what is the implication of U.S. foreign policy. There is no doubt that there has been tremendous change in the way in which U.S. foreign policy has unfolded in the past 2 years. President Trump has brought enormous amount of change, shock and awe, if you would, to conduct of statecraft. And the key question is, how much is there continuity, how much is there change, and how much of the change that he is trying to bring about will actually last? And what are sort of the fundamentals in U.S. Islamic world relations and U.S. Middle East and South Asia relations that are likely to continue going forward? There is no doubt that when we talk about the U.S.'s approach to the Muslim world, by and large, it's narrowed down to South Asia and the Middle East. And particularly after 9/11, essentially one rubric has governed this relationship by and large, which is the concern with Islamic radicalism and the threat of terrorism. That has guided policy in large ways. I don't mean necessarily in every single detail, but in large ways towards both the Middle East and South Asia. So whether wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, or in Afghanistan have had this element of concern with terrorism. And generally, the structure of U.S. relations with countries in the region is been very much concerned with the direction that Islamic radicalism and terrorism can take. And so that's not different right now. I would say the major difference is that we have a very different kind of president in the United States. Aside from his style, his use of language, his manner of conducting statecraft, there are certain fundamental issues that are important to note. And the most important is that he is essentially a maverick president. In other words, he has his own singular view of what world affairs should be, what conduct of relations with the world ought to be. He has certain fundamental views. For instance, he thinks trade is a bad thing. There's no point to it that economic relations between countries are zero-sum. One wins, one loses. It's a deal. There's no sort of a greater good that comes from the give and take of goods. He doesn't believe in globalization. He believes in America first, which, if it's brought down to its essence, it means that America or any country out there is essentially there to maximize the advantage, but not necessarily to build a global community. He doesn't believe in alliances or any permanent alliances. For instance, he's tried to weaken some of America's oldest alliances with Europe or with Japan and Korea, fundamentally believing that these are costly relationships that don't pay any dividend to the United States. And generally speaking, he has a transactional view of foreign policy. In other words, what do you have for me? What do you want for what I need you to do? And he doesn't believe that relations between countries goes any further than that. Now, this style has had a big impact on the way in which countries think about not just the United States, but think about the global order. and particularly regional order, and ultimately the way in which relations are conducted. Because, ultimately all countries conduct their foreign policies based on certain assumptions of some things that are going to be there. And if those things are not there, then countries will calculate and act very differently. Now, when it comes to Middle East and South Asia, generally speaking, there's a lot of differences between President Trump and his predecessors, President Obama, Clinton, Bush, the establishment of the Republican Party and Democratic Party, the foreign policy bureaucracy or economic bureaucracy. But when it comes to Middle East and South Asia, there are certain continuities there as well. There are certain continuities with the Obama administration, which I think reflect what is the general mood of the American public and the general mood, public opinion about why the United States is pursuing certain policies in this region and in the Middle East. And generally that mood among the American public is that the degree of engagement, military, political, and economic, that the United States has had in South Asia and the Middle East has been too much, and at any rate does not pay dividend, and that it's not serving the U.S. interests. And in fact, there's a very broader question as to whether or not the United States actually has an interest in Middle East or South Asia, or actually has the interests that for a long time were just seen as givens. That, we need oil, therefore we're in the Middle East. In fact, the United States is now the world's most important oil producer. It's now replaced Saudi Arabia as the swing producer. In fact, the greatest threat to Saudi Arabia is American oil. In the next 20 years, the United States will be the single largest exporter of oil. So the U.S. definitely doesn't need Middle East oil. The U.S. can outproduce Saudi Arabia and OPEC, and whether the prices go up or the prices come down. In fact, it's an economic threat to OPEC. So, but still in the mindset of many Americans, there was this assumption that there's some concrete reason why we have to pay more attention to the Middle East than to Africa or to Southeast Asia. President Obama was the first to actually challenge this notion. He was of the view that the United States was overspending in the Middle East and was not getting results, that it was spending trillions of dollars on wars and on democracy building, and it hadn't got anywhere. And I think he fundamentally believed it would never get anywhere. He actually was not convinced that the Middle East was ready for democracy, even after the Arab Spring, and that it was a fool's errand for the United States to invest in the Middle East, and I think by similar implication, invest in South Asia, or at least let's say Southwest Asia, that's Afghanistan and Pakistan and Central Asia. The term nation building at home, which you can sort of see reflections of America first in that term, was actually coined by President Obama. In other words, instead of spending money abroad, you first spend it on your own economy at home. It was President Obama who believed in less global leadership. There was a term that was used during his administration of leading from behind, which means that let others do more of the work, that the U.S. does not need to always be at the forefront of doing things. That doesn't mean that President Obama didn't believe in trade or in alliances or in the kind of long-run relationships, but he generally believed that the United States should do a lot less in the Middle East and South Asia, and the best thing that it can do is actually to start to withdraw from the region, which meant first, don't get involved in anything new. So if Arab Spring happened, don't roll up your sleeves and try to put a lot of money into it or get involved in building new democracies. You provide support, mostly moral support, some modicum of support, that's it. If Syria or Libya is collapsing into massive war, don't get involved, regardless of how much humanitarian disaster there is. And he, in a very disciplined way, resisted any kind of a public pressure, humanitarian pressure, moral pressure, ethical pressure in order to get involved in the war in Syria, believing that it would be a expensive, inconclusive quagmire. And then he actually started to withdraw from the Middle East in a very effective way. So the first promise he had made was to end the war in Iraq. And he saw to the end of that by actually bringing down the number of American troops in Iraq literally to zero. And that was unprecedented in American foreign policy history, because whenever the United States got involved in wars and then helped build a new order, it had always left forces behind to protect the new order. In Japan, in Germany, in Bosnia, Iraq was the first case where the US went in a war, changed the regime, created a new constitution, a new government, and then said, you know what, we're not willing to stay here and actually make sure that this works. You're on your own. And as we saw, that Iraq began to crumble after the US left. And then in Afghanistan, I think President Obama was never convinced that this war was winnable, and that the amount of military commitment that was needed in order to make a difference to Afghanistan was something that the American public would accept, or at the end would produce positive result. And I think increasingly his administration was convinced that some of the loftier goals about Afghanistan, like that it would be a democracy, that it could have a industrial economy, that its agriculture could be stood up, that you could essentially build a model country there, was unlikely to happen. And every story of corruption or Taliban attack or failures essentially reinforced this idea. So gradually, he first embraced the idea of investing enough in the military force in order to at least create circumstances that of sufficient stability that the U.S. could begin leaving Afghanistan. And this was based on the model of Iraq, where a surge had brought enough stability to have a power-sharing agreement that then became the basis for President Obama to withdraw the troops. So he agreed to put more troops in Afghanistan, but put a timetable on it. That this is a limited project. This is not an open-ended commitment. That the military has a certain amount of time to push back against the Taliban, to create space for some kind of a stable political order. And I think by the end of his presidency, he had settled for the idea of Afghanistan good enough. In other words, we weren't going to win there. There wasn't going to be a great victory there. We don't want defeat either, but maybe there's a way in which to just manage Afghanistan enough on the cheap, with less number of troops and less amount of American commitment, so it won't be such a preoccupation of American foreign policy. Now, this obviously had implications for Pakistan, which I'll come back to. But just to continue that thread of thought, President Trump, particularly during the presidential campaign, was not that far off on Middle East and South Asia than President Trump, except that he was even more forceful and more blunt and more unvarnished in his attack, for instance, on the war in Iraq. And he also believed that the United States should not get involved in wars in the region, that state building, nation building was not America's business, and that the region ought to take care of its own problems. And he was not willing to commit to Syria, he was not willing to commit to Iraq, and on Afghanistan too, he was not willing to commit to continuing these wars. And as soon as he came into the office, he actually began a process of talking about gradually reducing America's footprint in the region. In fact, the first place this conversation happened was about Afghanistan. What's different with President Trump is that President Trump, at the same time as he says he wants to do less in the Middle East, he also is acting as if he wants to do more in the Middle East. He wants to actually go back to an era where the U.S. would decide the architecture, security architecture of the region. So he also had grand ideas about the region. He wanted to come out of the nuclear deal. President Obama had gone into the nuclear deal as a way of leaving the Middle East, because by reducing tensions with Iran, by taking the Iranian nuclear program off the table as a cause of war, he had in effect made it easier for the United States to say that there's nothing urgent in this region and therefore we could move on to somewhere else. President Trump, on the other hand, has been escalating tensions with Iran, has a project of changing Iran's regional behavior, says that he wants to cut Iran's hands out of the Arab world, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and put it back in its box. That, to some, does not sound like doing less in the region, sounds like doing more in the region. And President Trump has had a view of creating a very close alliance with the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf countries, as a way of managing the Middle East. And that also is counter to the notion of leaving the region. President Obama had the idea that the Arabs should defend themselves, that they should learn to get along with Iran, that ultimately the United States is not going to sit between Iran and the Persian Gulf Emirates, and they have to figure out how they coexist in the region. Not that the United States would condone any action Iran did, but it wasn't going to be doing a massive amount of containment. President Trump talks about containing Iran, talks about a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries in containing Iran. That hasn't worked really, largely because I think the Saudi Arabia of President Trump's imagination is not real. President Trump sort of saw Saudi Arabia as a genuine regional superpower, as a country that is capable of doing what Egypt once used to do, of sort of managing regional affairs, having the military muscle to deal with Iran. And very soon it's become clear that's not the case. First of all, Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries have completely washed their hands of Syria. I mean, if you look today, the fate of Syria is being decided by everybody other than Arab countries. The countries that matter in Syria are Iran, Russia, Turkey, Israel, and the United States. The Arab countries are not there, and they don't want to be involved. They claim that they're busy in Yemen, but they would greatly appreciate it if the United States would take care of Syria for them, and would kick Iran out of Syria, but that they were not willing to do that. So, in Syria, they didn't show up. In Iraq, the elections happened. You ended up with a government that is more leaning towards Iran. The Arab countries have no influence there. And then, rather than creating a united bloc in support of policy of containing Iran by picking a fight with Qatar, in effect, Saudi Arabia and its allies, UAE and Bahrain, have broken up the Gulf Cooperation Council. It really doesn't exist anymore in reality. It's divided among itself, and at least Qatar and Oman look to Iran now a lot more favorably than they may look to their own neighbors. And in reality, the job of even containing Iran in the Persian Gulf is not there. And then the Khashoggi affair has severely damaged Saudi Arabia's international standing, and in particular has damaged its standing in the United States to an extent that the administration has to spend more energy defending why it's friends with Saudi Arabia than to use Saudi Arabia to actually achieve its regional objectives. So I think after this sort of contradictory foray into the Middle East, things have clarified a bit better for President Trump, which is that he now says we're out of Syria completely. And if Turkey is volunteering to take care of ISIS, all power to them. That actually suits us very well. And that, the Yemen war now has to finish, and that we're not willing to do any more than what we're doing there. So despite the heightened rhetoric, I think President Trump has fallen back to where President Obama was, which is the United States is not going to sign up to major involvement in the region. It's going to talk the talk about containing Iran, about regional behavior, but it's not going to put any muscle on the ground to actually kick Iran out of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And I personally don't think that there's going to be a war between Iran and the United States unless there is an unforeseen development, like one side does something provocative that escalates. But as a matter of planning, I just don't see it. It goes against the grain of where this administration is going. Now, to the eastern side of this issue, to Afghanistan and Pakistan, I would say that since 9/11, US's view of Afghanistan and its relationship with Afghanistan has been increasingly narrowed down to the issue of Afghanistan. Yes, there are other sets of relationships, but it's very difficult to detect them. That what else is that is important enough for at the highest level for the leaders of the two countries talk about? There's hardly any trade. There's the level of people-to-people relations, level of other sort of cooperative engagement on varieties of other global issues, regional issues are all missing. This has become, over the past 20 years, largely a security relationship. Maybe it suited security establishments on both sides because it's a very sort of a parsimonious, easy to manage relationship. And for Pakistan, it was always a double-edged sword. It both brought a lot of bounty to Pakistan, a lot of money that was targeted for counterterrorism and cooperation in Afghanistan, but it also brought a lot of pressure. During the Bush administration was the sort of high point of the United States viewing Pakistan and the Musharraf government as an ally cooperating on the war in Afghanistan. That changed during the Obama administration. There was much more of a jaded view of Pakistan, that the war in Afghanistan cannot be won either because Pakistan's not doing enough or that it is actually proactively helping the Taliban, that its agenda in Afghanistan is not in line with that of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that this is the correct view. I'm saying this is the view that became dominant. So then the question became that if Pakistan's policy, if Pakistan's strategy is not aligned, can we change it? And I think the Obama administration used varieties of different strategies to see, can it change Pakistan's position in Afghanistan? I think the positive side of this effort was that it was the first time that Americans actually seriously considered that Pakistan has different objectives in Afghanistan than the American one. I think in the Bush administration, there was a naivete of thinking that if we care about terrorism, if we like Karzai, if we want this, if we want that, everybody else, of course, obviously wants the same thing. And I think President Musharraf was willing to feed into that naivete by basically saying we're all on the same page. Under Obama administration, there was much more of a sober view that Pakistan is a sovereign country. We may not like its policies, but it has its own view on this issue. The question is, can those views be influenced? When I worked in the State Department with Ambassador Holbrooke, his approach was that Pakistan's relationship with the U.S., Pakistan's national strategy, its strategic calculus, can only be influenced if there is a trusting, close relationship with the United States. if the relationship between the two countries are transactional, exactly the way President Trump now sees the world, then nobody invests in a relationship. You only use a relationship short term, and you pursue your own goals. You're not going to hit your national interest on the back of a country that you don't trust and with whom you don't have a very tight relationship. So he pushed very hard for much greater economic relationship with Pakistan, much greater humanitarian relationship with Pakistan. But there were other voices in the US as well, those who thought that pressure works better. And particularly after Ambassador Holbrooke passed away, that view took over, that perhaps gloves have to come off and you have to put a lot more pressure on Pakistan. And particularly the US military, the longer it was not able to deliver on what it thought was a quick repeat of the surge in Iraq, began to increasingly blame Pakistan for that failure. The safe havens, what they saw as vacillation, what they saw as support for Haqqani network, varieties of things. And they began to favor putting a lot more pressure on Pakistan. This eventually sort of culminated in a direct clash during the Salalah incident, where a border shooting led to the death of 24 Pakistani soldiers. And I think that became a sort of a wake-up call for both sides. I mean, neither one of them wanted to really have a repeat of that or an escalation of that, and that the cost for both sides would be high. There was a period of chill, including Pakistan closing its border to Afghanistan, U.S. sort of downsizing its relations with Pakistan. Eventually, I think there was a formula found out for both sides to climb down from the tree. A sort of a tepid apology from the U.S., acceptance from Pakistan, the border open, and I think both sides sort of agreed to manage the relationship very narrowly in a way that they both could live with it. And so you had a period of, we went from intense interest in Pakistan to a period of kind of insouciance and ignoring Pakistan. And as Afghanistan left the front pages, and that idea of Afghanistan good enough made it less of a priority for American foreign policy, it was possible to manage this relationship. Now, just as President Obama, during the campaign, promised to come out of Iraq, President Trump promised that he would end the war in Afghanistan. And when he has come in, he has been focused on this issue. Even though the last we heard was a tweet, but I think before this tweet, unlike many other issues, there's been a lot of debate and conversation about Afghanistan. I know he's impatient about why this war has dragged on. Why is it the longest war in American history? I think he would love to be able to say during the presidential campaign next year that he has ended the longest war in American history. Especially he's achieved something Obama couldn't, which is to end this war. So he began to push the Pentagon immediately about, well, why hasn't this war ended? And what do you need to finish the war? And, military men always have the same answer to this question. We need more. And his answer was no. You get half of what you have currently, and you need to deliver twice as much as what you had promised, which was obviously a recipe for failure. And what we've seen in the past 2 years is that the Taliban have taken over larger parts of Afghanistan. ISIS has found a basis there, and the situation is actually more volatile than it was before. His instinct in responding to this increase in volatility has not been to say that, let's double down the number of troops, we need to do more. But I think as it's become evident is that he's become very serious about actually leaving Afghanistan. And by appointing a special envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad, and especially the choice of Khalilzad reflected the seriousness of the White House about leaving. Now I have to say the president is alone in this view. or at least in the way in which this is going forward. We've seen Pentagon, the Congress, the Senate even have censured him, and some of his closest allies have censured him. But I think he's of the view that this war, and I think this is instinctive to him, and he's not incorrect on this, that this war is not winnable. It's not winnable, at least on numbers, money, soldiers, deaths, investment that would be tolerable to the American public. And the idea of being in Afghanistan for another 20, 30 years is also silly. And in fact, it's evident that even maintaining the current sort of status quo may not be tenable either. You might need a lot more investment just to keep your head above the water. So if that's the case, you need to leave. If you need to leave, you need to have an agreement to leave by. You need to have at least a piece of paper with the Taliban that arrives at some kind of a ceasefire or end of war or armistice, if not a peace treaty settlement, that would provide you the basis to reduce your troops and ultimately leave Afghanistan. So that's what's been unfolding. And I think this is an idea, the idea of reconciliation, as it was called during the Obama administration, is not new. Ambassador Holbrooke started this. I think the difference then is that the administration was not committed to this. It was not willing to put real effort into it. I think President Obama was more attuned to what the domestic political impact to the idea of talking to the terrorists would be, quote unquote, and was worried that this would be seen as he being weak on national security. I think President Trump doesn't care about these things. He doesn't care. He doesn't think that a peace treaty with the Taliban would impact his base. In fact, he's fairly confident that he can turn it into the most beautiful treaty ever written. He's very confident in being able to sell it. So what he wants is actually the agreement. And the agreement ultimately is going to go to sort of the basics of why was the United States in Afghanistan in the first place. So it wasn't there for humanitarian reasons. It wasn't there to build a democracy. It wasn't there to build a capitalist economy. It wasn't there to build a nation, right? It was there to get rid of Al-Qaeda and to make sure that Afghanistan is not a base for terrorism. So I think the fundamental element of a deal is going to be around the core issue that the United States really worries about. And I think there are reasons to think that at least in the initial phase, there is seriousness and progress. I mean, one of the things that President Trump has brought about, although not intentionally, is that he has basically killed terrorism as a political obsession. Americans don't see it as their greatest priority. The biggest existential threat to them, in their view, could be President Trump himself, China, Russia, but it's not. They're not really obsessed with ISIS or an attack on America the way they were before. And if nothing comes out of Afghanistan to change their minds, they're not going to be obsessing about the Taliban too much, at least not the average American outside of the elite establishment. So that gives them a lot of political room to maneuver. Secondly, he is willing and capable to stand up to the foreign policy establishment and to Congress. And he's willing to put pressure on also some other regional actors to also get involved and engaged and work. Now, evidence early on is that Pakistan has also adopted a very different tack with this. In other words, it's much more positively engaged. It has released Mullah Baradar from custody. It has ferried him to negotiations in Doha. And the question is, why did Pakistan change its position? There might be varieties of reasons, including the fact that it may really believe that there is that this particular American president, with his particular ideas and the fact that he's willing to take on his own administration, may provide a unique opportunity to move past what is traditional American foreign policy, muscle memory, if you want to call it, the way in which it always acts. So, there is an opportunity to help the United States get out. If it's serious about getting out, if it wants, what it wants is a deal, if you're looking at what happened in Syria, if you're looking at what he's doing with Korea, with Europe, if you really see him as an opportunity, you may as well act on it. Now, I think this is an interesting moment for Pakistan. I mean, I'm not saying this deal is going to get done. It has to go through it has many conditionalities attached to it, including how quickly will it be signed, whether the Taliban play ball, what happens between the Afghans themselves, and whether Trump gets elected or not, and how far the deal would be if in case there is another president, and whether that president decides that this is not a good deal and scuttles it. So it's not a done deal. But if we were to assume that this moves forward, then it would be a period in which, during the deal making, Pakistan and the U.S. are genuinely on the same side and following the same script in a meaningful way. If not since 2001, definitely since 2009, since when Obama came to power. So that opens certain possibilities. And then the other question is that what if the United States leaves Afghanistan? What if Afghanistan is no longer a principal issue for the U.S.? Then what else is there between Pakistan and the U.S., right? What else will sustain a relationship? So, the answer to that, has to come from Americans, but it also has to come from Pakistanis themselves. Is it going to be trade? Is it some other strategic issue? Is it going to be a sort of set of regional initiatives? Is it going to be around a set of issues like climate, water, sets of things that also Europe or the US has relations with other countries? But it's an opportunity to go past this, 2 decades of Pakistan being narrowly defined in terms of security concerns and in terms of Afghanistan. And I think that's the more important challenge to deal with. Finally, the world has changed in important ways. In other words, when this story started, you could think of this region and say, other than India, it was really US and Pakistan alone, and everything else was fairly stable and static. But there are other big players in this arena: Russia and also China. China, of course, is familiar to Pakistanis. CPEC is probably the most forward station for the One Belt, One Road idea of President Xi Jinping. But China and the United States are also going through a change of relationship. And that does pose both opportunities and challenges to Pakistan. The entrance of Russia into Afghanistan, into Middle East, will also be an important factor. It's no longer going to be just between Pakistan and the United States. It's going to be how Pakistan navigates or takes advantage of what might be a much greater power relationship in this region. And even the relations with India will ultimately has to be put in the context of much broader set of bigger players that are in this region. So, all said, it is a period of change. I think the implications of Trump's foreign policy for Pakistan and for this region could be actually quite serious, quite important. They might be irreversible. I would say that there are a lot of challenges in it, depending on what happens in Afghanistan and what that means for Pakistan. But also there are certain opportunities for Pakistan. And it's a good time for it to sort of think about how does it want to move forward with the United States after Afghanistan. Thank you very much.